I'm going to go through this quite quickly. I know some of you are quite familiar with it, but for anybody new here today, we'd just like to explain a little bit about the offer. So welcome to the offer, which is presented by Culture Declares Emergency. Please put your name and organisation in the chat so everyone can see who is here, and we can share convos and links and sort of general thoughts and feedback. Let me say, we are recording the session. So yeah, we're recording the session. So if anybody would rather not appear in that, can you turn your computer or phone cameras off, but you can still get the audio. And please also make sure you are muted. So Culture Declares is a growing global community of arts and culture champions declaring a climate and ecological emergency. The crisis compels us to imagine new possibilities and to propose systemic change. Our vision is that the UK cultural sector declares and takes action on the climate and ecological emergency. Our mission is to grow and support a diverse community of cultural sector declarers, and our values to tell the truth, take action, and seek justice in the face of the emergency. Culture Declares Emergency offers an online toolkit to inspire and support pledges and declaration announcements and follow-up actions. We have designed kite marks, banner, leaflets, and sash designs, and community networking on social media and in events for declarers to share, grow and learn. Since its launch in April 2019, we are now over 1,000 individuals and organisations to have declared an emergency through CDE. If you haven't yet declared, we invite you to do so, and please get in touch via our website, culturedeclares.org, should you have any questions. A growing network of culture declaring movements now includes music, architecture, heritage and tourism. Culture Declares and business. Culture Declares Emergency works in solidarity with declaring movements globally to raise collective visibility and increase the urgency of our shared message. The offer is a response to the context of coronavirus and the devastating impact it has had on our society, and not least on the creative and cultural community. It is a space for anyone involved or interested in a cultural response to the climate and ecological emergency to gather, to question, to share, and to support each other. And we welcome you to come on board and to make your curatorial suggestions. It will be happening bi-weekly as of from the beginning of July, and that's on Wednesday, 11 AM until 12:30. And there are the opportunities as well for evening sessions if you have something that is more kind of nighttime inclined. If anyone is interested in making an offer and leading a session, please do get in touch at culturedeclares@gmail.com or via our social media. So we, last month, we basically presented our strategy for powerful, resilient and networked movement building. And thanks to all of those who have been part of shaping that. Many of you who are joining us today. Going forward, 3 working groups have been established: strategic change making, actions and events and communications. The next working group meetings will take place as of next week on Tuesday, 9 to 10:30, strategic change making, Wednesday, communications, and Thursday, action and events. Please join. Please make your expertise, your reimagining and your knowledge available, and it's good fun. It's challenging, it's good fun. So you can find out more on that through our website. So the creative and cultural community deal with the art of the possible. Collectively, we can influence more just and sustainable ways of being, doing, and thinking. Your involvement, however big or small, is valuable and essential. And so I would like to introduce this morning's offer, which is titled Arts and Culture Governance and Environmental Justice. And I'd like to hand over to Malaika Cunningham, who is a theatre maker and researcher with the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity based in Sheffield. And she will be leading this morning's session. Thank you so much, Malaika. Handing over to you.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. So I just wanted to offer a little bit of background on this session and the themes, I guess, that we're going to be looking at today before I launch into the first talk. So the focus of the session emerged out of conversations I've been having with Lucy Neal and Ruth Nutter. So I've been doing a PhD for the past 3.5 years with Kate Oakley as my advisor, who's joined us today, with the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity, which is based across a number of universities internationally. It's kind of led by Professor Tim Jackson at the University of Surrey, who's an economist as well as a playwright, and has written a great deal on the subject of sustainable prosperity. And I felt that a lot of the conversations that were happening within CUSP, I'm going to cease using the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity because it's quite a mouthful, so I'll just say CUSP from now on. But the conversations that were happening within CUSP, it felt like there was a lot of overlap there with what was going on within Culture Declares and some of the past offers I've attended. So we agreed that we should kind of bring some of that work to one of the offers with Culture Declares. So the strand of work that both Kate and I work within CUSP is the arts and culture strand. And we are kind of exploring the role of arts and culture within sustainable prosperity and creating sustainable prosperity. And now obviously that can take many, many different perspectives, as this discussion forum has shown. But the perspective that we wanted to look at today is around governance and policy making. So what role might arts and culture play in terms of creating environmentally just policy, but also what can we do to build an environmentally just cultural policy? So those two questions, I guess, guide the talks that we're going to be having today. So I'll speak in just a moment. Each of us will be speaking for about 15 minutes or so. So I'll speak first, and then I'll hand over to Kate Oakley, who I'll introduce then. And then we'll hear from Lucy Latham, who is kind of the co-facilitator for today, from Julie's Bicycle. And they'll be talking about their work. And then there'll be a time for questions and discussion around these themes to hear your thoughts and experience around the topics of governance and the arts and culture in terms of creating environmental justice or sustainable prosperity. Great, so I will kick off. So I'm a PhD student. I'm just about to submit my PhD, which is very exciting. And I also run a theatre company in Sheffield called The Bear Project. And with The Bear Project, I was one of the chapter chairs for What Next in Sheffield for years, which I guess is how I first became a part of the Culture Declares network, was through that work. I also work quite regularly with Cardboard Citizens and am a trained forum theatre practitioner. So that's influenced a lot of my work, both within academia and research and my theatre practice. And from January 2021, I'll be based within Arts Admin as kind of both an artist and researcher, looking at the interface between theatre practice and environmental justice. So today what I wanted to talk about is the role of participatory theatre in building democratic spaces. So the starting point from my research is that participatory and inclusive democracy is crucial to environmental justice and sustainable prosperity. So I guess this rests on the idea that sustainability is not a fixed goal that we will achieve. It's not just one outcome, but it is a process. It's something that we have to work at, that requires development and alteration and near constant change to live in a sustainable society. It requires reflexivity and transformability, both of which are fostered by involving citizens in decision making. So if society must constantly adapt and question its assumptions, citizens must be part of designing this adaptation and part of that conversation towards change that is near constant. So this is not democracy as we see it today in Westminster, which I won't go into, but I feel is a very deeply flawed and hollowed out version of what democracy can be. and is a poor tool for achieving sustainability, in my view. What we need to move towards is a more deliberative and participatory democracy, which is embedded across our culture. And I would argue that the arts play a key role in creating this deliberative democratic culture. So there's been great work that I'm sure many of you are familiar with coming out of King's and the Gulbenkian and What Next around the role of arts spaces and arts events as civic spaces. But what I want to focus on today, I guess, is the practice of the art that itself, rather than the buildings and institutions. So I'm going to be focusing specifically on participatory theatre, but I think a lot of my arguments probably extend to other art forms. They're just not my specialism. So I'm going to talk to what I know. So I think the participatory theatre can offer useful and distinctive approaches to creating democratic discourse and democratic space. When I use the term participatory theatre, I mean participation within the performance itself. So for example, within forum theatre, a tragic story is performed, and in the second half, the audience becomes spectators and can intervene in the performance piece to change the outcomes to potentially less tragic ends. And that for me is an example of participatory theatre, because the audience is participating in the action of the piece. You might also have participatory theatre that looks quite different to forum theatre, that's more like an installation piece where the audience participate from the first moment that they enter the space. So the ways in which these spaces I feel are useful for creating democratic discourse and democratic space, I'm going to talk about 3 key points. The first is its emotional life. So theatre spaces are emotional spaces. We often choose to go to the theatre because they're emotional. They make us laugh, they make us cry. We sometimes even judge the quality of the work through how it manages to affect us. They are explicitly emotional. And this is a big divergence from what we imagine to be traditional democratic spaces. There's a historic emphasis on rational discourse, on kind of facts and figures, and making political arguments. And I think that this misses a huge part of the way we actually talk about politics. I think that emotion in politics has often been derided as potentially manipulative, or it's a weakness, often when it's applied to women in particular, or it's kind of seen as less than the rational approach to political discourse. But I think that when we're talking about how we build society and how we achieve environmental justice, it is an incredibly emotional subject matter. And having those emotions within political discourse is important. It is a valid form of expression. So I guess within my work with Cardboard Citizens, I've seen many interventions over the years where spectators have got up onto the stage to make an intervention, and they've just been emotional expression. They've almost been non-verbal at times, where they're just, you know, cries of rage or upset, or kind of an opportunity to make a stand is like often kind of the language that people use to talk about those kind of interventions. And they are part of the conversation is in as important a way as those people who get up and talk about policy and facts and figures. And they help us to motivate political action as well. Political change can't happen without that emotional core. The reason all of us are in this room is probably something to do with an emotional connection to the issues that we're discussing today. So I think that it can be really useful for the emotional expressions to be put front and center within political discourse. And I think the participatory theatre spaces are uniquely placed to do that. because they accept and celebrate emotional expression, as many other art forms do as well. And just quickly as an add-on to that, I think that those forms of emotional expression can also open up who feels able to share in those spaces. People who don't feel confident with the facts and figures and rational discourse in that way may feel more comfortable offering an emotional response to an issue or subject, and valuing that as a contribution can help us to hear more voices in those democratic spaces. So my second kind of point on how the participatory theatre spaces can create democratic opportunities for a conversation is their liminality. So these arts events kind of happen outside of the everyday. You enter them and you kind of enter into a fictional world that feels outside of your everyday experience. This kind of state of being kind of in between realities where you understand things in a slightly different way. Spaces for, I guess, imagining possibilities as well. Things feel more infinitely possible within those spaces. And through that imagining, even if it's completely radical imaginings of how the world could be, that symbolic act can also make things feel slightly more possible when you leave that space back into the everyday. So I worked with a company called Metis on a show called We Know Not What We May Be, which was on at the Barbican a couple of years ago. And in that piece, you were a factory worker and you went into the factory of the future, and your job was to design what the world would be basically in 2040 through policies. And your labor as a factory worker was to imagine policies and vote on these different policies that other factory workers had designed. And within that space, it was of course fictional, and that's where its value lay, because there wasn't the limitations of everyday life and reality. The remit of what you could create in this imagined world was limitless. And I think through that symbolic act of imagining alternatives, we leave the space with more of a sense of the possible that we take back into the everyday. So yeah, so that's kind of my second point about how art spaces can be useful for creating democratic discourse. My third point is around the playfulness of participatory theatre spaces. Politics and political discourse and talking about the way the world should be enjoyable. It should be something that we look forward to and enjoy, because if we want everyone to engage in this, if we want a truly kind of inclusive and broad, deliberative, democratic culture, we need people to enjoy the deliberation. And so that playfulness feels really important to me, that it is not dry and serious, but it can be silly and fun, feels useful, that its proximity to entertainment, or sometimes just pure entertainment, is a useful part, politically speaking, of what the role the arts has to play. Yeah, it kind of keeps people engaged. And this playfulness can also be disruptive, which I think is another really useful part of the playfulness of participatory theatre. It can allow for, I think, more challenging or maybe even more subversive topics to emerge through its playfulness. So within forum theatre, there's a role called the Joker, and they kind of host the space. They kind of operate in between the actors and the spect actors. And in the UK in particular, this role is often very humorous. They're often poking fun, both at the actors and the people who get up. And that humor makes people feel safe, and it makes people feel able to get up and express themselves with things that they might find more difficult to express if that playful spirit wasn't there. So I think it plays a really important role in the safety of the space as well, that playful atmosphere. Great. So when I'm talking about the role of participatory theatre in democracy and creating a democratic culture, it's really important to also note one of its very crucial limitations. And that's primarily around inclusivity. I've used the word a lot to kind of talk about how we want more and more people to be involved in discussions around environmental justice. And actually, theatre is not very good at being inclusive. There's still only 20% of people in this country roughly engaged with theatre practice. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and talk about that and put that very much in the center of any discussion on what the role of theatre might be within democracy. Because when we talk about democracy, inclusivity is crucial. And so whilst there's many opportunities and excitingly distinctive opportunities that arts and theatre can offer in terms of how we create meaningful, exciting democratic spaces, we also have to consider how those spaces can be inclusive in an industry that is very often not very inclusive. So I'm going to hand over to Kate Oakley now. Thank you very much for listening to me for the past 15 minutes. There will be opportunities for questions at the end after all three talks. So if anything's come up from that, maybe just jot it down now and we'll have an opportunity to discuss it in more detail later on. Professor Kate Oakley has been my supervisor for the past 3.5 years, and she is the lead on the arts and culture strand within the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity. And she is also the head of school at the University of Glasgow in the School of Culture and Creative Arts, and has recently published a book around environmental crisis and cultural policy, which she's going to be talking about a bit today. Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks very much, Malaika. Thanks for that. It was great. It was a good summary of your PhD, which I'm obviously more familiar with than most people are. And thanks very much for inviting me to this. As Malaika well knows, I normally say no to all of these kind of digital things because I have not adapted well to the online world of COVID-19. I would much prefer to be doing this in a room, but all together. But there you go. As Malaika says, it is partly, I've got a new edited collection coming out next month from Springer called Culture and Environmental Crisis. And that's a little bit what I'm going to be talking about this morning. And the book tries to bring together, it's a series of chapters, an edited collection, as I say, so a series of chapters written by different authors, tries to bring together questions around culture and cultural production and the climate crisis. And in some ways, the starting point of the book is that there is a couple of problems with the way, for us, for the authors, myself and Mark Banks, the way that this alignment between culture and the climate crisis is often discussed. One of the problems, and I think actually the more pernicious of the two problems in a sense, is that that relationship is an automatically benign one. That culture is a good thing in the world, that more of it is a better thing in the world, the people who work in it are good people and on the right side, and that therefore their role in the climate crisis is a kind of benign one. Come back to that in a minute. And the second problem is that it's irrelevant. So if you look at most documents on environmental policy or response to climate change, as everybody in this forum will be familiar, culture is often either left out or plays a very, very kind of marginal role. So if it plays a role at all, it's a benign one. Most of the time it doesn't kind of play any sort of role at all. So the book is a very small attempt to kind of challenge that, both of those kind of problems. But as I say, I start wanting to kind of problematize really in a sense the relationship between culture and the environmental crisis in a way that I don't think it's often kind of problematized. And one of the problems I think that we have and we have to kind of get out from under somehow or other is that culture and the arts in the last 20 years or so in the UK and increasingly across the world has become part of something called the creative economy, this much larger discourse of the kind of creative economy, which includes a vast array of different kinds of forms of cultural production and consumption, and different kind of cultural forms. But it does, crucially, for my argument here, it does also include the arts. It includes many of the kind of art forms that people are representing today. And even though we may feel that the arts are a relatively small part of the bigger kind of world of cultural industries, they nonetheless have, I think, participated in and often wanted to articulate themselves to this broader discourse of the creative economy in the last, couple of decades, in part because it's brought more attention to a field which often feels quite marginalized. In some cases, it's brought more public funding. And if, for example, look at the recent debate since COVID of the threat to cultural infrastructure in the UK, this was often portrayed as a threat to an economic sector. That was the way the sector responded. This is a threat to jobs, this is a threat to livelihoods, this is a threat to a large economic sector. And we'll all have seen huge figures about how this is bigger than fishing and agriculture and various other parts of the UK economy. And many of those are, I have to say, wildly exaggerated if what you're talking about is the arts. Most of those huge numbers actually come from the inclusion of various forms of software in the numbers, which inflated kind of hugely. But we see this rather confused, I think, discourse that results from that. So I'm absolutely in favour of measures to save the publicly funded arts sector and indeed other parts of the cultural sectors. But I do think the campaign was sometimes incoherent. There was a very, very strong economic push. The statistics aren't always very reliable. We hear that this is a huge industry that employs lots and lots of people, but as we know, it can't afford to pay many of those people that it offers and that it employs. And when you talk to people who work in these sectors, they'll often say, I'd really like to pay my interns, students, workers, whatever, but I can't afford to. So it's an industry that claims on one hand to be a massive industry, on the other hand, doesn't appear to ever have any money to actually pay anybody. This is a real issue, I think. It has huge issues of inequality within the labour force. It's deeply unrepresentative of society at large. And these are all kind of problems which in some ways were buried in this kind of, and completely understandable, plea to government that we must save this massive sector of the economy. So I think that many of the problems that we see in this, the disparity in some ways between what the cultural sectors claim to be doing in terms of environmental crisis and the reality are result from this creative economy discourse, which has become increasingly kind of incoherent as it's gone on. It increasingly includes a large amount of kind of different sectors, different forms of cultural production, as I say, and those tensions have grown worse over time. So the bargain that was done in some ways by particularly the publicly subsidized sector in order to get in on the creative economy discourse and to benefit from that in terms of public spending, I think has in many ways become quite a problematic bargain. Many of these issues, of course, are rather ramped up by the COVID-19, and we see that across society. Of course, it's shone a kind of light on many kind of inequalities and multiple crises that our society faces. So it seems like a good time for the cultural sectors to be thinking about what to say about those crises, but also I think to be shining much more of a light than people seem always willing to do on their own practices. And this is one of the kind of problems that I suppose I often have in these kind of debates. And it brings me back to my point about the assumption that the role of the cultural sector in the environmental crisis is a benign one. So the cultural sector itself has many problems which it often seems to me to want to turn away from and see itself as part of, as I say, the kind of good guys who are fighting for truth and justice and all things good in society. When in fact it's a sector, as we know, that's built on low pay, often no pay, questions of exploitation, questions of exclusion in the labour force, and increasingly, in some cases, not all, cultural and media industries which are now massive polluters. Where digital technology and the kind of technology that we're all using now, unfortunately, has overtaken even aerospace in the production of greenhouse gases, and video streaming systems, including me, are all rather dependent on in lockdown are the emissions equivalents of various kind of nation states. So we're talking about sectors which are very much part of the problem, I think, and yet are often unwilling to accept that they're part of the problem. I find this across the board in all the work that I've done on the cultural industries, from looking at, you know, labour force issues to looking at issues of consumption and inequality, to now this issue of the role of cultural production in driving up various forms of consumption, in being a massive consumption sector itself, in being part of travel, in being part of advertising, marketing, lifestyle, in being part of that circuit of unsustainable production and consumption that we see in our particular form of late capitalism. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that all cultural practice is implicated in the same way and to the same degree. It clearly isn't, and there are many organizations, cultural practitioners who set themselves aside from that and who are pursuing, you know, very different kind of forms of cultural production and are very kind of cognizant of these issues, but they remain a relatively small part of this much bigger kind of sector. So what we're witnessing, I think, is on one hand a rise of new approaches in the economy in general that seek to kind of challenge the idea of economic growth as a desirable social objective in general. And while sort of cultural industries, it seems to me, have actually been quite slow in some ways in taking up these kind of issues, we have in recent years seen more critical consciousness emerge in some parts of that does want to engage with this social and environmental, with these debates about the social, environmental and ecological limits, but often without, as I say, recognizing the role of culture itself within that. And this is taking on a particular, I think, increasing kind of urgency and resonance is what we're seeing now. And we see it again with this debate about saving the arts sector, saving the cultural sector in the current COVID crisis, is that we're seeing very strong pressures to return for business as usual. And it seemed to me that even with this debate about the arts and saving the arts and all those kind of things, as I say, I'm absolutely not suggesting we shouldn't have had bailout money for this. And I work in another sector in universities, which will also be getting a bailout for the same thing. But all of these sectors are at the same time pushing for some degree to return to business as usual. And I think that is the kind of problem that we have to recognize. So what do we kind of do about this? I mean, the book has various kind of case studies and different kind of examples and different ways of looking at this. And quite a few of the chapters do look in particular at this issue of the huge environmental costs of cultural production. So I think we do need to start from a more kind of critical approach of our own practices, essentially, of culture itself, rather than seeing it as something that's kind of automatically benign, but seeing it as something which is implicated in the society we live in good and bad ways, and perfectly capable of the underpinning of many of those more or less desirable aspects of our society. What are the issues? I mean, we have, in some ways, it seems to me, one of the issues that struck me during the debates about, whether the sector would get a bailout or not was, do we have overproduction in this sector? Do we have simply too much of it? Is there simply too much cultural production going on in the world? Is there too many people working in it? What sustainable level of cultural production in many ways? The same inequalities that plague the cultural sectors, and particularly, I think, in terms of ethnicity and social class, also, of course, plague the environmental movement. And CUSP, the project that both Malaika and I are working on, released a report this morning looking at the backgrounds and kind of demographics, I suppose, of people in Extinction Rebellion, for example. And it's found, not remotely surprisingly, as many of these kind of things find, that this is massively, amongst those people, this is massively overrepresented by the middle and upper middle classes. So many of the exclusions that plague the cultural sector also plague the environmental movement. And that it's always made me really, really anxious about this immediate assumption that both of these things work well together, when in fact they both have many of the same kind of problems of exclusions. So on what basis, I suppose my question would be, and I absolutely do not have any answers to this, and neither would I would say, although I'm obviously trying to plug the book, neither does the book, but on what basis can we rethink the role of culture in our society more kind of broadly? I'm not pleading for a return to the pre-creative economy days of just saying, you know, cultural sectors are a good thing, they're subsidized by society, and it's all just kind of the subsidized kind of sectors, and it's paid for through taxation, and it becomes a kind of add-on. The dangers of that, it becomes a kind of add-on to other kind of economic activities. You have sets of policies for, you know, what we regard as kind of high culture, and then you have commercial production of other kind of culture, and never the twain shall meet. That's the situation we were in 20 or 30 years ago. The creative economy discourse tried to bring different cultural forms of different kind of things together. I think largely, partly successfully, but increasingly unsuccessfully. And now we have a situation where we have a massive array of different kinds of cultural production forms, all under this rather unfortunate heading of the creative economy, often identified with a growth project, an economic growth project, which is what keeps the whole thing going. How can we kind of rethink that without ignoring the fact that the market does a lot of production of culture? I mean, lots of the culture that I consume, lots of other people consume, comes to us through a market. So I'm absolutely not asking for a return to the kind of state model. But how do we rethink that relationship with the growth kind of project? One of the things, I'm just wrapping up now because I think I might have gone over time, but one of the things that people will always say at this point often in these debates is something about UBI and universal basic income, and do we need some way of decoupling artwork from, you know, the need to kind of earn a living, etc. Is that one kind of policy way forward? Another thing, I'm not a massive fan of UBI for reasons that I haven't got time to go into. Another thing that I think we might try to think about is whether we can think of a different role, certainly for parts of the cultural sector, as part of a kind of universal basic services in a sense. Part of what it is to lead the good life is to have access to theatres, to have access to libraries, to have access to culture. Is there a way of rethinking it as something that we feel that all humans should have access to, and therefore the production of it becomes in some way associated with the production of health and education and all the other things that we might think are absolutely core components of a decent life for everybody? Does that again just reduce it to a sort of a kind of welfare good? So I think we need, as I say, I don't have the answer to this, but I do think we need to rethink a paradigm for cultural production which is outside of a focus on growth, while recognizing that the sector itself is part of, while recognizing the sector itself is part of that kind of problem, and therefore needs to, in interrogating wider society in the way that Max was suggesting as part of the kind of democratic discourse, it also needs to interrogate itself far more than I think it generally does. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Kate. That was great, and a really useful provocation to go in thinking about in terms of decoupling the sector from the growth project. Yeah, it definitely feels like that relationship has been only emphasized within within COVID-related, I guess, policy drives. So it'd be really interesting now to hand over to Lucy. Lucy Latham is the policy programs lead at Julie's Bicycle, and has a background in both environmental science and political theory. It's interesting to bring those things together within Julie's Bicycle. So I'll hand over to you to talk a bit more about the work that you guys have been doing recently.
Thank you, and thank you to you both for those very inspiring and thought-provoking provocations. I absolutely echo what Kate was saying, and I think in an attempt to demonstrate the cultural sector's value in these incredibly reductive parameters, we too have become part of the growth bind, and it is a bind. However, there are certainly people, you know, so many to mention, but I see this becoming more of a conversation now within collections care and management, sort of challenging the more is more. Some interesting prompts from Frances Morris at the Tate, and in artistic aesthetics, like the lighting designer Pauline Constable challenging in her work this idea of more is more. And I definitely think there is far more thinking to be done. As you may or may not know, Julie's Bicycle's focus is very much on centering culture within the context of environment and climate action, and balancing the opportunities of culture with its impacts. So, our approach, from a sort of political theory perspective, is not exactly critical, but it's very much about acknowledging that the managing of impacts is central to the advocacy and the creative work and the confidence and the platform of integrity people are then positioned from to talk more about these issues. So the practice and the advocacy are deeply interconnected. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So I'm just going to share my screen as I have some slides for you. Okay, so yes, my name's Lucy Latham. I work at Julie's Bicycle, have done for the last 7 years. And our two key objectives are to, one, support culture to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees, and the second, to advocate for culture to inspire action on climate change and sustainability. So you can see in these two objectives, there is an equal focus on environmental impact understanding and management, and hence decarbonisation, which is what is required of us to meet our climate change targets, and then to understand the roles and opportunities for arts and culture in driving societal change. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about a particular framework, sort of contextualize what I'm saying today. And first to note is that there are all kinds of these sort of bigger national, international frameworks that people are increasingly locating themselves within, whether it's about science-based targets in accordance with the Paris Agreement, whether it's looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and having a broader frame of reference when we're talking about environmental, social, cultural, economic progress indicators. However, there is plenty of criticism that you could level against the SDGs, but we can come back to that. Green deals, the new Green Deal, different climate change legislation, or maybe it's the emergency declarations and the sort of galvanization of things like culture declares emergency, music declares emergency, that this sort of time is what is accelerating action, or different ways of looking at our economy. And regenerative economics is something I'm personally very interested in. But what I'm going to talk about now is actually the Green Deal, and looking at what's sort of coming out of Europe right now. And I would say also that our cultural commissioners now within the EU who are really taking culture seriously. There's some really exciting work happening within the European context, not that that's potentially much good to us at the moment, given Brexit, but the level of thinking about culture, society and sustainability are certainly becoming much closer, and it's really exciting. But the three underlying principles of the European Green Deal are what you can see, the bullets here on the left hand side, and that's no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, so effectively decarbonisation towards net zero emissions. The economic growth is decoupled from resource use, so we're talking about efficiency gains, circular economy. We'll come back to growth because we've already had some great inputs on that topic. And lastly, no person and no place is left behind. So this is speaking to the just transition narrative. Now, something to probably mention here about the European Green Deal. it really is about an investment, an economic stimulus package promoting green jobs and green infrastructure, with the objective of tackling climate change and the biodiversity crisis. In the context of the EU, it is still based on a paradigm of economic growth, but there are plenty of others in Europe and in the UK and other countries besides who are trying to promote similar programs that have a different sort of alternative economic model that is underpinning it. And I attended a very recent talk recently, and it was sort of about growth, post-growth, and the European, the Green Deal. And a phrase really stuck with me, that this sort of Green Deal conversation is a battleground of ideas. And I keep coming back to that. Our idea of a Green Deal, of a Green Deal for culture, may be radically different to somebody else's. And I think, like a lot of climate policy and climate legislation, there is a lot of rhetoric around social justice, but but in terms of how that then actually practically manifests, can be quite variable. So this is the idea, it's a battleground. If social justice is central to such a framework as the European Green Deal, then is that necessarily, is that compliant with also the economic growth paradigm as well, and modern capitalism? So all kinds of things to contend with. But the reason I'm starting with this is because it's triggered a lot of internal conversation at Julie's Bicycle. So what does this mean for culture? As this amazing moment of time, amazing in all senses of the word, and now talking about recovery, talking about economic recovery, or even, in fact, economic depression, which is quite likely over the coming period, how that's impacted on social justice agenda, how that's impacted culture, the need still to act decisively and ambitious on climate change. So what then, in terms of a culture, a socially just and environmental cultural recovery and sector, what are we actually looking for? What are we trying to achieve with this? And how can we have that very critical perspective that I heard from Kate's and Max's earlier commentary? How do we keep that lens of the way that we're looking at the role of culture and potentially broader the creative industries? Okay, so I'm going to probably move quite quickly through these next slides, because I want to ensure that we've got some space to talk further. So something that we've really been thinking about this Green Deal for culture is, what kind of premise is this based on, and what are the insights from Julie's Bicycle that we're actually using to inform our ideas and the discussions that we're having? And they sort of loosely conform into these idea of data, policy, and people. And we'll go back into that towards the end of my slides. But for us, this is how change happens. Probably everyone's theory for change somewhat reflects this, but this is really inspired by some of our big policy partnership programs and what we sort of come to see in a lot of the ways that we work. And that one understanding is that when people have data and an appreciation of their impacts, that knowledge leads to taking action. And from action, we then share practice, we create a community of knowledge and ideas and learnings, what works, what doesn't work. And this creates a sense of leadership and starts to build our leadership capabilities, with the idea that eventually we move into what we kind of have dubbed a new creative ecology, a low carbon cultural economy based on understanding, acting on impacts, having very practical frameworks for change within, and then using these to support our work. So what, in terms of building understanding, that might look like, for us, it's about understanding attitudes and actions within the sector. So we've done a census to really understand the sort of journeys that people are on within cultural institutions. We work with people to understand impacts. You may be familiar with our carbon calculator, the Creative Green tools, which is designed by and for the creative industries and helps people understand their impacts in relation to the sector and their progress year on year or between activities. Or it might be taking more deep dives into cultural buildings and conducting audits and sort of building surveys to really understand impacts in order to develop a plan or a strategy for reduction. In terms of action and leadership, so we see that in a whole array of different creative interventions, whether it's going through a sort of certification, like the work that we've been doing with New Adventures, whether it's developing a new environmental strategy, like you can see here, the V&A have done, the Curzon Cinema Group have done, the Brits have been doing in terms of their event management, whether it's the artwork, for example, everyone who is contributing at the moment to our past and current Season for Change programs. Or maybe it's attending training programs or starting to build communities where you are developing resources on different impacts that may be related to the cultural and creative industries, taking part in a movement for change like Culture Declares Emergency, like Music Declares Emergency. All kinds of actions that the sector is taking in order to take this sort of space of environmental leadership and be recognised for it. Now, I don't think that we're quite yet can say that we're in a sustainable creative ecology, but it's interesting to think about the kinds of things that that could look like or feel like. So it might be around funding. So you will be familiar, of course, well, not of course, but quite possibly, as it's our biggest flagship programme, our partnership with Arts Council England, which is an example of tying environmental policy to cultural funding and investment. Or some of the work we've been doing with cities across the world, in partnership with World Cities Culture Forum and C40, for how cities in all different geographies are connecting their culture and climate change agenda. Or perhaps this essential focus now on looking at culture and climate change through the lens of social justice, and exactly you know, how that shifts our ways maybe of cultural production, cultural consumption, our ways of organizing, our ways of orchestrating our cultural activities and buildings and events, etc. And we started a while ago to try and piece some of these ideas together and came up with this framework called the 7 Creative Climate Trends, which is to sort of make the case for culture as an ecosystem whereby you can't just tackle the artwork, for example, or you can't just look at materials or look at policy without looking at all the leadership of organizations or artist activism or the artwork itself. So this framework of the 7 Creative Climate Trends, which you can find on our website, is all about understanding these different lenses that are all interconnecting and overlapping and dynamic, but it's to represent these different spheres of influence that the cultural and creative sector has in influencing the sustainability agenda, and I guess vice versa. So just to go through a couple of impact here, because we have to have some knowledge of our impact to know what's working. And this is why so much of Julie's Bicycles narrative actually comes down to data. And data, for a lot of us, probably is not a very sexy area to think about, but it really is the bedrock for Julie's Bicycle's work. So, and probably the most comprehensive data set we have is by working with Arts Council England as their environmental programme delivery partner. And through that, we're able to collect this amazing data set of carbon and environmental impacts in the cultural industries, arts and culture sector. In the case of Arts Council England, it's of course the nationally funded sector, but a whole variety of organisations use our free carbon calculator, and it builds this really useful data set and evidence base, definitely the most comprehensive evidence base that exists anywhere in the world. And what it proves to us is that when you tie together policy, investment, and a support structure, you create change. That's our premise here. Policy plus investment plus support, there is a transformation. And some of the numbers that come out of not only our quantitative data, but also the qualitative data that we do every year, the surveys, the census that we do each year to really understand the actions taking place in the sector. And these are some of these statistics that come out of this work. And I'll just draw your attention to one here at the end. The 49% have produced programmed or curated work exploring environmental themes. Now, it's really interesting to note that this number increases year on year. Of course, it's unsurprising given our current context, but our at least anecdotal insight here is that the more people taking steps in-house to manage their impact and to understand them, we see more communications, we see more advocacy and more programming as a result, because there is that greater sense of confidence and integrity that, you know, you're walking the walk before you talk the talk. Again, this frame of a new creative ecology. So we're looking here at some of the changes in governance, directors and board level representatives with environmental remits, people looking at sustainable production methods. So, you know, there is some of that cultural consumption, at least from the perspective of the organization there. Thinking how sustainability is included in broader organizational strategies, whether it's fundraising, whether it's business development, whether it's something more commercial, or perhaps ethical sponsorships and partnership policies. So this is really demonstrating that environmental sustainability is outside of its compartment or, you know, particular role within an organization, but it's actually becoming embedded across the piece, and can hence be used as a criteria in decision making. And then various benefits reported of taking environmental action. And, you know, this is also a case of when you prove something works, it leads to more change. So I'm sure many of you have been involved in the consultation of Arts Council's new 10-year strategy, but over that sort of iteration of sector consultation, environmental sustainability has emerged as one of the 3 investment principles, sitting on its own, and really, you know, that focus, that 1 in 3 focus, just shows what has changed since 2012, when Arts Council England took the leadership decision of including environmental reporting in its NPO requirements. Now, just because I mentioned cities before, again, we're seeing these amazing trends happening within the context of local governments across the world. And this is something that a piece of work that I was leading in the context of Julie's Bicycle, particularly working with World Cities Culture Forum and their network of global cities, and looking at how cultural policy and strategy increasingly was inspired and connecting to the climate and environmental movement. Now, if you've ever worked with or within a local government, you may be aware that there is a historic issue, like so many other places in society, where we have the very compartmentalized ideas and climate and culture. You know, those people would never meet. They might not even know who's in those respective departments. I think that is changing now, and there is much more interdepartmental working, or working towards missions, as the economist Mariana Mazzucato puts it. So we're seeing all these great ideas, new creative programming, new ways of engaging a city's cultural sector, having responses that reflect local place, local geography, local culture, and that are responding to also those same cities' environmental needs and vulnerabilities. And I think this slide just sort of summarizes some you know, what we found across so many of these programs, and this relates to something that we did quite a long time ago in partnership with ACF and the Environmental Funders Network, and it was looking at the gap in between cultural funding and environmental funding that stops some of this great work really flourishing. And what came out of these sector roundtables with these different groups is what kind of things can we be, you know, really focusing on it? Is it about investing in creative responses on these environmental issues that's, you know, building this new narrative that's using the power of storytelling to reframe our human relationship with the natural world, or taking an approach that's perhaps more practical, looking at resourcing and investing in the environmental impacts of the sector? One way of doing that is pegging cultural funding to good environmental practice or environmental policy. Ensuring that we have this whole networked response, a constellation of different actors that are bigger than the sum of our parts, that bring together people from artistic disciplines to building managers to cultural funders and investors, and demonstrating this interconnectivity and the ecosystem that is the arts, and that we need all of these players to be acting in concert to even to meet our sustainability objectives. And lastly, just because I'm running out of time there, evidence. So this comes back to my same point that I made earlier about data, about understanding impact, about understanding what works and being able to share that. Our evidence base gives us the platform of integrity and allows us to extend our ambition further. So some of the things that we've learned, I've already mentioned this notion of the ecosystem. I think something that we're all probably familiar with. We know that the creative content, you know, we've never been a producing organization, with Season for Change perhaps being with alongside Arts Admin the exception. But what we've been focusing on is how you create the frameworks to drive then or inspire or support the creative content. Because as we know, artists have always been inspired by the natural world. The natural world has always been a muse. Thinking about purpose of culture and the arts, thinking about carbon emissions and impact, the 1.5 degree world, and of course, the inseparability of that to social justice. Evidence and data, as I've mentioned, the critical function of support structures, which is absolutely essential within the all of the programs that we work on, is the facilitation and the exchange of good practice, the creating the conditions for learning, for new skills, for getting people into a room and sharing, and then being able to scale what works and learn from what doesn't through collaborations and partnerships. And then, of course, advocacy, communications, and celebration is our sort of latter points of this slide. So I'm just going to move forward because I'm definitely running over time. And just to finish, you may be familiar, I'll just actually stop there because I can send it around in a link afterwards. But Julie's Bicycle have been doing some recent advocacy to the Department for Culture, Media and Sport about cultural recovery and the necessity for that to speak to the environmental agenda. As we know, there is no recovery societally without it's underpinned by climate action and climate justice. So this is sort of shorthand of the letter that we've put forward, and you may have seen in The Guardian or some other media outlet about what we've been sort of asking for, that speaks to, I think, the learnings of some of these projects that I have just ran through. So I will stop there. And apologies for maybe taking too long on that.
Not at all. Thank you, Lucy. That was really, well, for all of the presenters, it's been exceptionally interesting and very provocative and lots of food for thought. So I think there's a Q&A session now, isn't there, Lucy and Malaika? Yeah?
Yeah.
So I'm just having a look through some of the questions. Actually, this is probably coming back to you, Kate. I think some people would like you to perhaps just talk a little bit more about why you have some reservations to the idea of a universal basic income, and perhaps just elaborate a little bit more on your idea of the universal basic services. You happy to do that?
Yes, sure, yes. I had a horrible feeling as soon as I mentioned that people would say, why did you like UBI? Because everybody on the left is supposed to like UBI. Why don't I like it why don't I like it? I think it essentially, I think we're in a highly unequal society, and anything that doesn't rest off from that point is problematic. And I think therefore, essentially atomizing everybody and giving everybody the same amount of money in a highly unequal society merely leaves that situation unchanged. Now, the argument for UBI is always that if you give everybody some income, it will allow them to have more autonomy in terms of being able to refuse certain kinds of work. It'll strengthen them as a worker. It'll allow them to live with dignity, etc., etc. But it doesn't really alter the broadly unequal status of our society, and it doesn't really involve huge amounts of redistribution, which is what we need. My second problem with it is that it doesn't really respond to need. So you get the same amount of money if you're an able-bodied single person with no kids and no particularly ongoing health problems, as you do if you're somebody with a disability, ongoing health problems, and 3 kids. And so then society needs to step in and do lots of other kinds of things in order to mitigate those kinds of problems. So I think that's basically my argument. I think it's like saying, instead of having a national health service that responds to need, you give everybody in the country health vouchers up to a certain amount of money, and then they can save them up and spend them when they need it. But there's a really good reason why we don't do that, which is that some people don't get sick very often, and some people have ongoing lifetime conditions. And so I think it's actually better to have a set of universal services that respond to people's needs rather than to atomize everybody by giving them a certain amount of money. That said, and all of that said very quickly, the current crisis is one to which UBI would, I think, be a good response. I think the current, I mean, you have to be as old as me, basically, to remember when we had unemployment on the scale that we're going to have it, you know, in the next 6 months. We've had long-term, you know, economic problems in this country in the last 20 or 30 years, but we haven't had mass unemployment since the 1980s. And it's going to be a shock to quite a lot of people who were, you know, born since then to see what really mass unemployment looks like. So I can understand that the pressure for UBI at the moment would be quite a good response to something like that kind of particular crisis. So it may be that its moment has come, and that all the problems I have with it can be set against the fact that it does stop people from living in poverty during a period of absolutely mass unemployment. But I think the universal services idea, the idea that you make things like healthcare, education throughout life. Public transport, for example, I've never understood why you have to pay to go on a bus in a city. It's entirely in our interest that people travel around on public transport. It should be free. Libraries, parks public parks are free. And I think lots of cultural facilities could be seen in that way as part of the things that citizens require, which should be provided to them throughout life for free, and to which can then respond to their kind of needs. So that's why I prefer universal basic services to UBI, because I think it doesn't atomize us quite as much. It doesn't treat us as single individuals in the same way. That's
great. Thank you so much for just opening that up, actually, Kate. It never occurred to me about the possibility of, of this sort of, getting away from atomization and moving it more to where where the resources are needed. And so I think that's really, really interesting. And for me, it's a big takeaway from this meeting. Does anybody have any particular responses to that? I'm going to ask Lucy and Malaika if they would like to open up to do some breakout sessions, and whether or not that's a point of discussion, if there is something else that would like to be discussed for the breakout sessions. So I'm kind of opening it up a bit here to our, in a very democratic way, to our lovely attended wonderful people. Okay. I'm going to have to unmute people. Sorry, beg your pardon. One moment. I'm going to. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I have to now show my slight lack of. I have to unmute everybody. One moment, please.
Interestingly, Anne Pettifor is also against UBI, and a much greater focus on the need for creating jobs and people being within or jobs that support the massive investment in green infrastructure that will be required to decarbonise the society. So I also found that interesting.
Oh, is everybody unmuted now? No, I might have to ask Polly to come in and just help here.
Unmute ourselves. People can unmute themselves.
Right. Please unmute yourselves. If anybody has a wish to sort of to open up this discussion. Okay. Polly just said, Polly, do you want to say your point there at all?
Yeah, it was just that thing that, and I know it's impossible. It's maybe impossible to avoid in some way, but well, I can see that argument about universal basic service, but I think that can be equally reductive because someone will decide what those services are. So yeah, I don't know if it's a combination of the two. Actually, is what will come at it from both sides, rather than a group of people deciding this is what the people need, which.
I suppose so, but I think people do remake things. Well, I mean, in a way, you could say that somebody, our Victorian forefathers decided, and it was generally fathers, the public parks were what we needed, and they were mostly to keep kind of working the people out of pubs. But we've remade them, haven't we? They were decided that's what we needed, but we own them. We've done something with them, and I think that's happened with libraries, and it happens with schools to some degree. I mean, less so because of the ridiculous pressures on curricula in schools. But I mean, I think once services are available to people, we do remake them by using them and inhabiting them in a way. So they're not just as given to people.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. There's a comment from Kelly. I thought Kay's point about National Nature Service or Universal Nature Service is relevant here. Should we open that one up for discussion? You there, Kelly?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, it was something that sort of I've thought like sort of helping educate people more about about the natural world and how they are part of it rather than separated from it, and actually able to enhance public spaces and be part of that, be part of nurturing and growing and being responsible for, rather than something that they just sort of pass through. Can that somehow be part of a cultural offering or an understanding of how we inhabit our spaces? So there's sort of the idea that a lot of public space is now becoming private space, where you're excluded from it rather than included and part of it is sort of worrying to me. So how do we find a way of belonging to space and participating in it and sort of actually being like feeling you're entwined with it and responsible for it, rather than you're just sort of there on borrowed time.
Yeah. Can I say something to that one as well? Then I will shut up because I know I've talked quite a lot. But I totally agree with you, and I think it's been one of the really deleterious effects of lockdown, which is that we've been essentially locked into private space, and we've been told that this is good for us. And I'm not saying there shouldn't have been locked down. Obviously, there should have been lockdown. But I do think that we've got the politics of space wrong during this lockdown. We've kind of, in some ways, we've kind of celebrated the home and the family and being indoors, and this is what's good for us, and this is what's going to save us, because outside is scary and all that kind of thing. And I think that actually we should have, certainly with the outdoors, I think we should have been allowed out into the countryside and out into the world at a lot earlier stage, once it was realised it was safer to be outdoors in many cases than indoors. And I think there's going to be a lot of unravelling of that massive kind of valorisation of the private, the indoors, that we're going to have to do over the next sort of couple of years. I think I almost lost my mind one day when I was listening to the radio during the pandemic and during lockdown, and somebody from a national park was saying how great it was that the national park was closed because nobody could come, and this was really good for the tiny number of people who lived within the borders of this national park. And the kind of privatisation of the countryside that's gone on during this period is absolutely appalling.
Yeah,
I completely agree. I find it, and not only the countryside, but actually spaces within cities that could be garden spaces for people to inhabit and pause on their way to places, that you're pushed out or that you're not allowed. But the other thing that worries me is that people forget how to look after the natural world, that they don't care, that they can leave, that they leave rubbish, or that but there's a lack of empathy with it. And I just wonder how you sort of bring the two together. You want people to care and be part of it, and at the same time feel connected to it and responsible for it.
Yeah, are there any more thoughts on this particular point? Yeah, I'm going to come back to Malaika. Yeah.
Sorry, I've had to switch to my phone because my laptop's being a bit dodgy, and I have no idea how to do the hand raisy thing on the phone. So.
I'm just watching.
I'm literally raising my hand. Yeah, I think that there's something really interesting that's been thrown into focus in terms of COVID and public space, and coming back to the universal basic services and the need for far, far, far more public spaces and access to those public spaces that is more equal. To be outside and also have a relationship with it that is based on kind of collective ownership, because I think what you're saying, Kelly, like is absolutely right, and I think that kind of respect and relationship can also come down to it feeling like it is collectively ours, rather than a privatized space that we enter into sometimes but bear no responsibility for, because we also bear no rights to it. And that kind of relationship between rights and responsibility, if we collectively have spaces as citizens, it feels like some of those issues could be potentially addressed.
Yeah, very good point. I concur with that one. I'm just flipping through. If anybody has a comment to make, please put your hand up. If there's any thought. Yeah, Polly?
This is kind of going back actually to something that Malaika, well, linked to both what something that Malaika said and Lucy. It occurred to me actually, Kate, that one of the things I like about the universal basic services is that it's not fundamentally monetary based as UBI is, which just kind of reminded me that something which I've been worried about since the DCMS emergency package announcement is, in order to get that, the arts were, or the cultural sector was forced to take a position that was so financially based. We had to make our case ago, the economic impact of the arts, the economic, and we were pushed further and further down that route. Then we've been given this whacking load of money, And I think it's going to be very difficult to come back out of that little cul-de-sac and talk about the impact of arts and culture within society generally, and particularly within a response to climate crisis. And I didn't know if Lucy, particularly, you had any sort of thoughts on that, because I just think there's a real danger that we've now been placed down that route, that we have economic value and that is what we are going to be judged on. And in terms of a green recovery, yeah, I just didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I agree. I think it's quite a long-standing trajectory of that happening. And I think we also see it in the how the kind of, to me, and I do not profess to be an expert on this subject, but the language around the creative industries is to encourage arts and culture to be privatized and to make money rather than be subsidized by the state. And it's this sort of perpetuating cycle, and then in a bid to become further financially independent from public money, there is this pressure on having commercial activities, cafes, restaurants, some of which certainly can be quite environmentally focused, but the amount of gift shops you see in museums with bouncy balls from plastic crap from all over the place, and you think this is not part of a sustainable move for the sector or for the environment. But in terms of this sort of modern, this current package of money, I mean, it was what we were trying to achieve, that it would be part of a broader program towards the sustainability of the sector from an environmental and a financial standpoint. What things can be implemented that are sort of working towards both of those goals? I'm not really sure if we're in a better position at the moment to be working towards that. All I do know is that there are a huge amount of personal and organizational commitment from the sector in doing as much as they possibly can. However, of course, we're right now incredibly constrained by all manner of different things. And the concern for us is, of course, the environment is going to fall down the agenda.
That's great.
As much as we wish it, wouldn't, because of the practical context that we're in. I think it inevitably will.
It's lovely, Lucy. I'd like to bring in Nawal. And she said there is also another evolution, which is to declare an environmental body a legal subject. And I particularly would love to hear her mention this. We only have a few minutes left, but also just to say that in 2 weeks' time, the next offer will be on the crime of ecocide, and it will be a discursive event with practitioners and campaigners who for the last 10 years have been working, and longer, to put the crime of ecocide into legal law. So yeah, I'm going to pass over to Nawal. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to just say a little bit about this, because it's a really interesting evolution, whereas we come back in a way in the way we were thinking, like, for example, a river could be a goddess. For example, in the Greek or in the Roman, there was a goddess named Ignatius. So we are coming back to encompass the environment and to give it a new right, a new place, which can be it's not very extraordinary, because we are able to create many virtual organizations. We could create, for example, a corporation. Corporation is nothing but just an institution. It doesn't represent anyone, just material things, just economic things. So why did we just cut off from the nature to just give this right to material things. That's really the way that we have to understand, so we can go back and give back to the nature its right in the environment, in the planetary system, because everything is based on a system. The nature has its own laws, which we had to respect. And to respect them, we have to understand, for example, water, the living of water, from the point it goes, the clouds, everything is a cycle. And until now, we are just focusing on a little place, on a little property, and we are taking everything out of it without giving back. But even in the nature system, there is a rule, a trading rule. If you take from nature, you give back. So it's really important to declare, for example, a river a legal subject, so they can be at the same foot as the corporation or as the human.
Wonderful. Now, while I'm going to have to, because this is a wonderful moment to draw this, and we can pick this up. And if you're available, please join us in 2 weeks' time. So we're going to bring this right down to the rights of nature, and there will be discussion about Polly Higgins, the late Polly Higgins' extraordinary work as well. And yeah, we'll be sending out notice of that in just under 2 weeks' time, but please put it in the diaries. And very, very warm thanks to everybody who's contributed to today. All of you who have made the time to be here. We really appreciate it. And many, many thanks to Malaika, to Kate, and to Lucy as well. So stay well, and we look forward to meeting you all again very, very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.